soft, cozy, sheep, shoe, 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 soft, cozy, sheep, shoe. The Allbirds Wool Runners. Comfy sheep made from shoes.
Hello, we are Team 5 and the team members are Suyash, Shansi, Patsal, Sakshi and me, Claudia Sanchez. For our team presentation, we chose sustainability in supply chain because we believe that it's not only important to focus on reducing cost or improve efficiency, but it's also important to have sustainable practices as managers in the future of supply chain. So the table of contents for this presentation will be Allbirds background, which is the company that we are going to focus on, supply chain evaluation, sustainability pursuits, and challenges and recommendations. Background. So we chose sustainability because it is the key for the future. And there are so many global issues that we are facing right now and that we have to be aware of, such as climate change, human rights, fair labor practices, and corruption. And sustainability gives us the opportunity to improve these issues with the pillars of sustainable practices, such as economic viability, environmental protection, and social equity. So, as I mentioned before, we want to focus on Allbirds because it is a company that is a great example of sustainable practices. Allbirds is focused on the industry of apparel and footwear, and we realized that this industry doesn't have like a lot of sustainable practices, and Allbirds is taking advantages of this by innovating and having sustainable practices. This company was founded in 2016. The name comes from New Zealand because this country doesn't have a lot of mammal animals, and all of them are birds, well, most of them. And the mantra of this company is create better things in a better way. And they first started with the business model direct to consumer, and they improve it by omnichannel retailer. And the objectives of this company is simplicity in design, confidence in comfort, and made from nature. And we are going to talk about all the materials that they use, and their goal is to be the world's most comfortable shoes. So as I mentioned before, this company is a great example of sustainable practices. It is environmental friendly, and some of the practices that they have is sole for soles because they give it a new life to all the shoes that can't wear again. They also have a low carbon footprint. They use natural renewable raw materials and recycled materials when it's possible for them also. Also, like 90% of their packaging is recycled, and they are investing in carbon offsetting projects. One of their first accomplishments of them is that they were certified as a big corporation, which is very important for these kind of companies that are looking for being sustainable. Now Sakshi is going to talk about supply chain evaluation.
Hi, I'm Sakshi, and I'm going to talk about supply chain evaluation. Before we venture into the supply chain evaluation and sustainability practices of Allbirds, let's take a look at what carbon footprint is. Since we know all the companies and the countries around the world are focused on reducing the carbon footprint. So what is carbon footprint? It's the total number of greenhouse gases emitted, which is caused by any individual or an organization, which increases the temperatures of the earth really high, resulting in global warming. The apparel and the footwear industry does not focus too much on the sustainability practices, and hence, if all the 24 billion pairs of shoes produced in 2019 had 30% lower carbon dioxide emissions, we would have saved like 98 billion kilograms. Here is the product description page of Allbirds, and as we know, they are B Corp certified, so they focus a lot on sustainability and they consider environment as a stakeholder. Here we can see in the sustainability ratings, they have an option right there in their product description page. And if we click on that, this is what we see. Here we see they have more plants, less plastic, so they're focusing on reducing the plastic consumption. They also have all the details of the sustainable materials, and they're also providing us with all the details of how they make the shoes. For example, Swift foam is something which they use from the previous recycled shoes. Okay, let's also move on to supply chain mapping now, because Allbirds has an extensive network of supply chain mapping where they make sure that all the suppliers are tracked and they can find out faults in their supply chain. Here's a list of tier 1 suppliers which Allbirds has released publicly so that they are open and transparent about their whole process. Also, to be a part of the suppliers network of Allbirds, every supplier has to go through an extensive audit where they have to ensure that they are following fair trade practices, fair labor laws, and have sustainable environment altogether. This is the Allbirds long-term plan, and as we know that indicative ESG risk rating is something that all the companies use for supply chain and sustainability analytics. Here they have been ranked into top 10% of all the companies and top 10% of all footwear companies, and they have been carbon neutral since 2019. They have reduced 14% of their emissions in 2021. They focus on doing 50% by 25 and 95% by 2030. Now, Suyash will talk about sustainability pursuits.
Thank you, Sakshi. Now let's look at the sustainability pursuits of Allbirds. It's focusing on 3 different things primarily: regenerative agriculture, responsible sourcing of their materials, and sustainable transportation and reducing energy. And also focusing on some external projects as well that we'll talk about later. So with regenerative agriculture, they're mainly focusing on making sure that 100% of the wool that they use comes from regenerative sources. And they will also be reducing 100% of on-farm emissions by Allbirds wool. So in 2021, they have already partnered with a company in New Zealand and some of the other major players in the apparel and footwear industry, Smartwool and Icebreaker, to launch a new framework to really trace and map all the carbon emissions as well as other sustainable practices such as animal welfare, environmental sustainability, and social responsibility. And they have already made sure that 15% of all the farmland in New Zealand is using regenerative farming. So now let's look at the renewable materials. Their goal by 2025 is to make sure that 75% of their materials are sourced naturally or either by recycled materials. They want to reduce their carbon emissions by 25%, and most importantly, they want to reduce the raw materials that go into their products by 25%, which I think is way more important than the prior 2 points, as by doing this, they will reduce the weight of their products and further increase the appeal of their products to customers. And they also want to double the lifetime of their products. And this is also really important when looking at the long-term impact of everything that gets manufactured. So in the industry, nearly half of the footwear and 2/3 of the apparel use synthetic materials, which come from plastics that are made by fossil fuel. So this is something that they really want to avoid, and I think this is a really good step for the industry to catch on to, using natural materials and less of the synthetic ones. So some of the materials that they use are wool, like we already talked about. The others are sugarcane and tree, which both come from natural sources, and they have even mentioned where exactly they come from in Brazil and South Africa. And more importantly, they use natural rainfall and less irrigation, which is very good for the soil and reduces water consumption. And they've also created a new material called Trino, which is a blend of wool and tree. And it is something that they have also partnered with other companies to use. So it's a step forward. And some of the other materials that they use is recycled bottles, as not everything can come naturally, so they are still relying on some of these synthetic materials, but they're making sure that they come from recycled sources. They're also using castor bean oil, recycled cardboard, bio-TPU, which is also something unique that they use, recycled nylon, and the Trino EXO, which is another version of the Trino that I just talked about. Now, Chauncey will talk about the responsible energy of Allbirds.
Thanks, Yash. And this section is about the energy part. And by 2025, Allbirds want to achieve 100% of renewable energy for all its finished good manufacturers and also its own and operate facility. And also, they want to achieve at least 95% of ocean shipment. Why this is important? Because let's see the comparison here. For the air freight, it will release about 500 grams of the carbon dioxide per metric tons of cargoes per kilometers of transportation. Yet for the ocean shipment, it only releases 40 grams. So you can see the significant gap here. And during the COVID-19, Allbirds also used and achieved 84% of the ocean shipment, which is amazing, considering the unstable routine and the shipment schedule. And it also recalls me my experience at Walmart. And during that time, because of the unstable schedule, Walmart chose to do the opposite way, which is using lots of air shipment. And here, Allbirds sacrificed the business, the income, the revenue, just for the sustainability. And more than that, Allbirds also want to educate its customers. Like by 2025, they want to achieve 100% of customers can use the machine wash with cold water, and 50% of customers can use hand dry. And besides the internal projects we covered, there are also some external projects that Allbirds participate in. And they said before they reach on the zero emission, they also taxing themselves and use this money for the sustainability projects globally. Like here, there are projects in Argentina, the projects in the United States, and also the projects in China. And all these projects are used to offset the carbon dioxide that Allbirds currently releasing. So the issue we want to address here is the supply chain's negative impact on the environment. And the solution we provided is the Allbirds model. And we call this as the whole supply chain sustainability. And this is all based on the philosophy of the sustainability and its value towards it. And based on this, Allbirds select scientific methodology and start on the supply chain mapping. And based on all of this, they initiate all these projects and they are also taxing themselves to use money to invest in the global sustainability project, which is very amazing. So for the next part, also we'll talk about the change and future recommendations.
Thanks, Chauncey. Now we'll be talking about the challenges and recommendations that we have for not only Allbirds but also the entire industry as a whole. So some of the current limitations that the team saw was that firstly, any of the carbon footprint measurements visible to the public eye was all based on declarations by Allbirds. And so some of the gaps we saw in the measurements that was declared by them were the brick and mortar retail stores, as well as online store visits by customers, because believe it or not, even customers who are visiting their webpage are causing some emissions through the use of electricity. So realize that omni-channel experiences are the future. So this is something that should definitely be included by Allbirds as soon as they can. Another thing that the team noticed was that Allbirds also needs to focus on complete life cycle product management. So not just when materials go into the product, but what happens in the aftermarket, whether the products are recycled by customers. And we saw that Allbirds actually does offer incentives to customers to return their shoes, but they only provide a credit to those who are returning shoes that are still usable and reusable in good condition. but we believe that Allbirds should find a way to kind of recycle the materials even for shoes that are not in wearable condition, as the materials themselves will be valuable for reusing. So this would promote a circular economy, and one of the examples is that the Portuguese shoe manufacturing association actually recently signed a green deal to look into the devulcanization of rubber soles so that the entire industry as a whole can reuse them. So I'm sure many of you recognize these top brands in the shoe industry and the apparel industry. One thing is that there's a huge entry barrier in this industry. Believe it or not, Nike actually spent $3.11 billion in advertising in the year 2022, and that comes up to $60 million per week. So for a new player like Allbirds to enter the market would not be easy. Just for sustainability as a value to customers alone is definitely not enough, which is why Claudia earlier referenced how they're one of the most comfortable shoes on the market. So there's a lot more value that needs to be delivered to customers in order to make a successful brand for sustainable companies. And some lessons for the industry would include economic levers as well as supply chain transparency. So traditionally, as we all know, money makes the world go round. So there are more incentives and penalties that are required to sort of control these actions of players in the industry. So for example, R&D for any green initiatives should be subsidized by governments. There should be rebates, as we mentioned, and there should also be a worldwide carbon tax on a macro scale, because currently it's not compulsory in all countries, and companies do this on their own accord. Another thing is supply chain transparency, which is what Sakshi was talking about. And this is also extremely important, and we do recognize that for incumbent large companies, it's more difficult, but it's definitely important for them to stay relevant as well, because they can hold every single tier of their suppliers accountable. So recently, in just February 2023, there was actually a group of investigative journalists from Reuters who sent a bunch of shoes to a recycling program jointly run by Dow Chemicals and Singapore government, and they found that out of all 10 of the shoes were actually not recycled and were instead sold in the Indonesian aftermarket. And so a huge investigation has been opened into, and a lot of the stakeholders are being interviewed and investigated, and so that's one of the case studies that we saw. Sustainability and due diligence by sustainable companies is very important. So thank you very much for listening to our presentation.